Genesis chapter 12. We're just going to be just in a few chapters in Genesis this morning. Praise God for awesome message last week. Ray's preached. I was out of town and we were on vacation and got to enjoy some palm trees in the ocean and had a lot of fun there. And I had decided I love going to churches when I'm on vacation, because I like to try to see what it's like to be a visitor. I know. And y'all need to know there's no church that does it perfectly. You know, it's tough. It's tough being a visitor, isn't it? It's tough being a visitor. You're trying to get to know some people. You don't know everybody. You want to talk to people, but it's kind of hard to it's difficult. I know it's difficult for you, and it's also, you know, hard for people who love people, and sometimes you just catch the first person you talk to, and then you just end up talking with them the whole time, and you're like, man, I wish I could have done that with everybody that's here. And so it's tough on both sides, so I get it. And so if you're visiting with us today and nobody has quite wrapped you up, if you just stick around after church for a little bit, I'll talk with you all afternoon, and we can get to know each other. I want to. So and there's others that would too. So, but I wanted to go. I wanted to see what it's like to be a visitor. And so I had this, long story short, I show up at this church. And there was probably about 600 maybe in there. In the service I was in. And we sing a song, and then, let me back up. When I went, I knew there's no way this was going to be Faithway, all right? And so I was getting myself ready for that, because in my mind, no church is like Faithway, and I just love it. But also, you know, I'm sure there was going to be some things that I didn't necessarily agree with. But I set out in my mind as a visitor, I'm going to only think of things that are pure and lovely and honest and true. And I'm going to focus on that stuff. Because there's always going to be things that just you don't like, or you might not necessarily agree with. So I was just trying to find the good, right? And so I sang one song, and then one of the pastors gets up, and he starts making fun of altar calls. I was like, pure and lovely, pure and lovely. I'm literally doing this. Pure and lovely, pure and lovely, pure and lovely. And they started making fun of just as I am. How can you make fun of just as I am? And I'm like, pure and lovely, pure and lovely, pure and lovely. You know, and so I thought, I love Faithway. I love altar calls. And then they started downplaying communion. He's like, you know, a lot of people, they take communion. They think you need to think of your own sin and reflect on that stuff. I'm like, what are we doing here? Have you not read? Have you not seen? Have you not heard? And so it was all I could do not to get up and walk out, and I stayed. But ever since, that whole last week, I was reading through my Bible. I started reading the Bible over again on my birthday, which was last week. And so I was in Genesis. And the Lord just kind of arrested my attention on Abram and some of the altars that he built. And I know it's not the same exact thing as an altar call, but I just started studying that out some, and just letting the Lord just speak to my heart. I was blessed through this study, and it could have just been for me, but I'd like to overflow it out for you guys to see if maybe the Lord can speak to your heart in a way too, like he similarly did with me. In the Old Testament, you'll find a lot of altars that got built. I don't know if y'all have ever built an altar. Some of y'all may have. But in the Old Testament, they would build altars. Many of them they made sacrifices on, but there was a few that they didn't necessarily make a sacrifice on. But they had built this thing called an altar. Noah built an altar after the flood, and it was kind of an altar of praise. He was spared. Abram built 4. We're going to talk about his 4 altars today. Isaac built an altar and worshiped in Beersheba, so his was like an altar of worship. Jacob built a couple altars in Shechem and Bethel, seeking God's guidance, and so his was kind of an altar of like prayer for guidance. Moses built an altar after victory over the Amalekites and at the foot of Mount Sinai, so you could see like victory in that. Gideon built an altar and worshiped God after destroying his father's idols, so you could almost see like an altar of rededication. Samuel built an altar before going to war. So you see altars built after war and before war. And so this could have been an altar of asking God to bless the fight to come. Elijah built an altar on Mount Carmel. You guys remember that? And he begged God to send fire down. And you can see an altar that was a desperate plea for a move of God. David built an altar, and it was almost like an altar of forgiveness. Solomon built the altar at the temple. Ezra rebuilds an altar that had been destroyed. You see altars being built through the Old Testament of the Bible, and there are more than that. And one of the things as I was praying about these altars and what they were about, or what we can say about each one of these altars, is that they were altars that involved giving and receiving, or receiving and then giving. Giving and receiving, or receiving and giving. There is one example I just gave you. There was an altar someone built and begged God to show up. Let's say Mount Carmel, for example. Giving prayer to God, and then guess what? Receive fire down. And some received and then gave. Some received the victory over the Amalekites, and then they built an altar and they gave praise and they gave thanks to God. These were moments where God was being worshiped. These were places that people dedicated to God, that showed their devotion and dedication to Him. Abram, in the Bible, in Genesis 12, verse 1. Let's look at his altars. If I had a map, I would show you how Abram traveled 700 miles north to Haran, and then he's going to get ready to travel another 700 miles south again. And on the pathway, he travels up, and can you imagine traveling that far without like a car? He was in the land of Ur, and he travels up north to Haran, and then he's going to travel south. And let's look at now the Lord, 12:1. The Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Man, there's so much to that, and you can read about that promise and that truth throughout the Bible, even into the New Testament. But he's there, and he's told, you need to get out of the country, and so he starts traveling south. He travels he had already traveled 700 miles. He travels about another 600 miles. And then he builds an altar. So let's look at that first altar that he built in chapter 12. Verse 6, Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, or you could call it Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thee will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. He had a moment. He had had moments with God. God had already shown him and told him, get thee out of thy country and to a place, and he had already given him a promise. But as he travels down, he gets to this place, and then God shows up. And this was going to be a place where he was going to set up his tents. There's people that are like, well, how come you can't find archaeological evidence of Abram or Abraham and all his travels? The dude lived in tents. You telling me you're going to like find tent stuff all those years later? He travels down and he sets up his tents. And one of the things, this is what you're going to find. And this is one of the things that jumped out to me that just spoke to me when I was reading this text about this guy who lived all these years ago. Wherever he built his tents, wherever he pitched his tents, he built an altar. Wherever he was going to stay, he built an altar. He wasn't going to stay in Haran. He went south and he put his home there. It was a temporary home for a little bit, but he made himself a place called an altar, and it was where God had appeared into him and reinstated that promise. There are, in my life, places. How many of you have a place that's special to you? A place that's special to you. Seriously, like a place that you might pray, or a place that you might talk to God. Raise your hand. All right, a ton of you guys. I have a place. It's been a prayer spot of mine for 15 years that I have enjoyed going to this place. I have a few of those places, and I have maybe 3 or 4 places that to me it's a place that I've just kind of dedicated to God. That when I'm at this place, I'm going to focus solely on my Lord. And here is a moment when God came down, the presence of the Lord came, and he made him a promise. He builds him an altar. And I'm sure he sacrificed to him. But remember, the Canaanite was in the land? This was his promised land. This was the promised land. This is where he was supposed to be. He had made it into the promised land region, but there was Canaanites in the land. And I just kept thinking, too, about how he had got that command of God to travel south, to come into this promised land, and then he did it. But it wasn't like there was like people there making the tunnel for him to pass through when he got there. Like, hey, you did it. You obeyed God. It's just like he shows up in this place with no celebration, but God knew that he had went where God told him to go. Man, it's a special thing when you know you're following the path of God. And when he got there, he builds an altar. Canaanite was in the land. There was probably some kind of issue with them, and he travels. He doesn't travel too far. He just goes about 20 miles again, and he builds an altar between Bethel and Ai. Genesis 12:8, look at that, the very next verse. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he did what? He built an altar unto the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And so you see that first altar he built, he had established himself a little bit. He wasn't going to stay there forever, but where he was going to worship. And he built an altar. Presence of the Lord is noted. The promise of the Lord is noted. And here you have like worship. It was a place where he would worship. And he worships and he calls on the name of the Lord. He calls on Yahweh. I love that even not completely settled, and in the midst of you could call enemies still in the land, he is going to worship. It doesn't matter who's around, you ought to be able to worship your Lord. It doesn't matter how settled you are just yet. You should be able to dig in and worship. I guarantee you, you go find you say, I want to find a place. I want a place like those people that raise their hands have. I want a place like that. I guarantee you, God will let you find one. I guarantee you He'll let you find one. It could be in the most random place, but if you set out and you're seeking to find a special place where you can be alone with God, and it can be a place where you devote that place to the Lord, I guarantee you He'll bless that effort. He has built a second altar. And then a famine comes. You guys know the story. Abram has traveled down. He's not Abraham yet. He's Abram. He's traveled down. He has stopped there, built the first altar in Shechem, and then travels down just a little bit south, a little further, near Bethel. And then a famine comes in the land. And it drives them down to Egypt. Still, a little side note for you, maybe Bible scholars, if you know the answer to this, you can maybe give me the answer to this later. I've been trying to figure it out. But I don't know if he was supposed to go down to Egypt just because there was a famine. I can see how easy it would have been to go in self-preservation and things like that. But he went to Egypt. The famine took him down to Egypt. But it was when he left his home and his altar and went down to Egypt, he starts lying about his wife. You remember the story. He starts lying about who his wife isn't or is or what is she. And in life just seems like it's just not what it needs to be down there. And then look at Genesis 13, 3 and 4. He gets ready to come back. I read this note. Abram's physical return to the place where God first spoke to him in the promised land was paralleled by a spiritual recommitment of his life to God. For the first time since he left Canaan for Egypt, Abram called on the name of the Lord. Because when you get back to his homeland in chapter 13, verses 3 and 4, it says, "And he went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been, at the beginning between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the what? Of the altar, which he had made there at first." And then what did he do? And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. It made me ask myself this question. And I'll ask you the question I just asked myself. Have you had a habit in the past of getting alone with God, worshiping Him, getting in His presence, communing with the Lord? You used to do that, and then for whatever reason, life happened. Let's call it famine. Famine happened, and it drove you away from what you used to do. Now, we don't know, we can't say for sure that Abram didn't worship the Lord down in Egypt, but we do know he started lying. And when he came back, he started calling on the Lord again. Have you drifted away from what you used to do? Come back. Come back. I love saying it. God is as near as your next prayer. You can get away from God for 1 month, 1 year, 10 years, and you can draw real near to Him just like that. You seek Him, He's right there. Amen? Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about? You've been away, come home. Come home. Then when he gets back and he's back, then there's an issue with the herdman. You guys know the story. And he had a bunch of animals, and Lot was with him, and he had a bunch of animals, and the herdsmen started fighting with each other, and they're like, hey, we got to split up here. we can't stay here together. And so they decide to split up, and Abram's like, hey, Lot, you pick anywhere you want, and he picked his area. And then God meets with Abram again, and he said, look north, look south, look east, look west. It's all yours here. And so then he goes and finds a kind of permanent home. Let's look at that. The altar at Hebron, Genesis 13:18. Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there a what? You see that? Wherever he had his tents, he had an altar. Wherever he was staying, wherever he thought he was going to maybe set some roots up, he built a place. He had a place where he would worship the Lord that was designated for that purpose, that was designed to be a place that was dedicated for his devotion and worship. And there, in that place, God renews his covenant again and expounds on how he would bless his seed. The promise that God made for him in this place was based on a promise that wouldn't happen for 25 years. He builds an altar here, and he worships a Lord who made him a promise that wasn't going to happen for 25 years. I think in our day, that's really hard for us to wrap our heads around, isn't it? Waiting for 25 years for anything. You know how long it takes you to pay your house off, right? You know how that takes just like a whole lifetime, it seems like, or whatever. You know the feelings. Can you imagine waiting like he was waiting on these promises? But he was in a place, this is going to be their home. This is going to be a place where they could just rest a little bit. This is going to be a place where they could settle some. This would be a place where he would die and was buried. And Sarah, his wife, would die and be buried. His son would be buried. His daughter-in-law would be buried. His grandson would be buried. And his wife would be buried, all in this place right here. He found his home. He found where he was going to stay. And he built an altar. I know you don't need to physically build an altar. But if this church, if you think, hey, this is a place where I feel like I could take root and make this my church home. I'm telling you, and some of you were here when we did it, but this place has already been prayed over and dedicated to the Lord. This place here has already been set apart and sanctified for the Lord to be worshiped and glorified in this place. Really, what you need to do now, if you haven't done it yet, is just to be able to maybe say, hey, I think maybe this would be the place where my family can claim is one of our places where we know we can come and worship and praise God, where the presence of God is. And this is going to be one of our places. I pray that if I were to ask that question again a week or a month from now, everybody in the room would be able to say, I've got a place where I worship the Lord, where I can get there, and it can be me and God, even though there's a bunch of other people here, but it's a place where I worship and praise my Lord. I hope that this could be one of those places for you. He built an altar there. He was home. Then a series of other things happened. You know the story. Abraham had a son. What was his name? Well, I say Abraham had a son. God changed his name to Abraham. All right? I'm not going to get into all that today. God changed his name to Abraham. And then they have a son. His name is what? Isaac. But God had, even though Abraham was settled, and he had a home. He had one more altar that he wanted him to build. Genesis 22. Years had gone by, and God had made this promise with Abram that he was going to bless his seed, and guess what? He didn't have any kids. So you know the story with Hagar. And so now Abram's got a kid with his wife's maid, Hagar, Ishmael. And then about 13 years later, God's like, no, the promise and the blessing is not going to come through him. It's going to come through your seed with your wife. It's going to come through you two. Remember, she laughed? Remember the story? She laughed, and then God's like, why'd you laugh? She's like, I didn't laugh. He's like, you did laugh. And so God names Isaac. You know what his name means? Laughter. Like, I'll show you. I'll name your kid Laughter. And so he names it. And one of the other cool things, when God names things, it shows his ownership over them. And so he names they have this kid Isaac. Well, then there comes a day where God tells Abraham to go take his only son and to go take him on a 3-day journey up on a mount and sacrifice him. It's one of the hardest stories in the Bible to read, really, if you don't read it with the eyes of faith and understanding. It's really difficult to read. But when you read it knowing that God had made a promise to Abraham that he was going to bless him through Isaac. When God tells him to sacrifice his son, Abraham has to know that God is going to provide a way. God is either going to raise this boy back up from the dead if I have to go through with this, or he's going to provide a lamb. He has to know that because he's already received the promise of God. And so they go and they get up and they go and they travel 3 days. The day after God tells Abraham to do this, the next morning he gets up, he gets all this stuff. They walk for 3 days and they had all this stuff to build an altar with. And they get about 3 days in and there were some other people with them and they turn around and he says, you guys stay here. He says, me and the lad, we're going to go up yonder. And then he says, we're going to come back. And they're walking off, and they've got the stuff to make the altar, and here's Isaac, this lad, and he says, Dad, we have the wood and we have the fire, but where's the sacrifice? Where's the lamb? He knew what that was like, and Abraham's like, God will provide. And so they get in Genesis 22, verse 9, and they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him upon the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, saying, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by the horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him upon the burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. And And this was his fourth altar. This would come in a place, in the same place, literally, geographically, would be in the same place where Jesus would later come and die on a cross. This was the same place where God sent His only Son down to the earth, and God had an altar. He had a sacrifice that needed to be made, not just to cover sins for a year, but to take away the sins of the world. And so God sends His only Son down. I love in Hebrews 13:10, this is awesome. It says, to Christians now, it says, we have an altar. We have an altar. In the whole text, when you get to that point, it's referencing Jesus Christ, what He done. Christ is the altar and He is the sacrifice. Christ was both. Christ, the all-sufficient sacrifice once and for all that was made on that altar that we call the old rugged cross. And by securing salvation for you and for I, Christ is a place where we can now go. And we can go and we can give and receive, or we can go and we can receive and we can give. He's the place where we can go, just like they did in the Old Testament, and they can celebrate victories. Christ is a place that we can go and we can beg for victory in a war that we're getting ready to be in. He's a place that we can go. Christ is that we can ask for forgiveness and plea. He's a place that we can go just to enjoy the presence of God. And as I think of coming all the way back to the beginning, what I said about altar calls, I just couldn't shake the thought this whole week. For me and where I'm at with the Lord right now, I don't ever want to not have an altar call. You know why? Because not just was this building sanctified, prayed over, and established as a place where God's presence was, and we are here to devote ourselves to worshiping Him, but also this literal front right here is what we call an altar. This is a place where we have also dedicated. Now, you don't need to have an altar to live fully for Jesus. You don't have to have this. You don't have to have padded kneelers. I get that. But we have dedicated a place for you to be able to come, to kneel down, to beg for God to move because you're in a desperate place, to maybe call on the Lord, to maybe rededicate your life, to plead for forgiveness, to celebrate victory, to just thank God. We have one. We have one. And it was built by people that are in Christ, that have an altar in Christ. And so as I close this service out, I want to give you an opportunity to be able to come to the altar. All right? You don't have to. But I want to give you an opportunity to come to a physical place that has been dedicated for the purpose of all these things that I've said. Worship, talk to God, ask for forgiveness, thank God for something, rededicate. I want to give you that opportunity to do that with every head bowed and every eye closed.